We are recording. So Willow, everything that you say now is going to be written in stone here. So
no pressure.
No pressure at all. We're gonna rewind back and say, remember at 2 minutes when she said this, I'm gonna try this. So just to give you an overview of what we'll cover, this is really geared towards our introduction and our session goals. Really, this is geared towards the 0 to 5-year-old. I think if you're a parent at Vivvi, that's really where our expertise lies, in the early childhood space. And so we're really focused on starting the solids, kind of infant feeding basics, progressing up through the toddler months. I know we've got some parents with some older kids here, and I would say there's probably a lot of best practices that you can get out of this, especially with Willow thinking about these long-lasting impressions of a healthy experience with food. But just so you know, that's where we're going to cover the most ground. One disclaimer, you will find throughout the session that Willow is such an expert and really has such good advice and best practices. But it's important that we are not the end all be all of the expertise, that please get your pediatrician involved and a nutritionist if that's something that you feel like you need a resource outside of the pediatrician. Willow, I just learned that not every pediatrician has a nutritionist on their team. I don't even think when I was thinking about pediatricians that was even something to consider. So for those of you out there feeling like that's an important resource to also consider as you go. And I'm sure this is what we're always thinking about our own children, but they're all so special and so unique, and each path is individualized, and some of this is about figuring out themselves and the world around you, a world around them. And so I think it's going to naturally be a challenge one day, and you're naturally going to have a win the other day, and you're never going to be able to predict when those occur. And so really kind of balancing that information with knowing when maybe there is a problem to seek advice. Anything you would mention with those statements, Willow?
I mean, I second all of them. My pediatrician does not have a dietitian that works in his office, and he and I have many interesting conversations. So I think that if you do talk to your pediatrician and end up having specific feeding questions, it's really nice to find a registered dietitian who can help, because they know a lot about infant feeding if that's their specialty. And I also think that when it comes to eating, and I hope that I can convey this today, it's all a win. Even the things that seem like losses sometimes are still lessons learned about food by children. And so I think as parents, we kind of are so hard on ourselves sometimes, but hopefully today at the end of this, you'll walk away feeling like you have more wins than you thought that you did.
It's amazing. And to top those wins off, we'll be sending everybody some resources from Willow, some one-pagers and some great resources to look up after this. So we'll fill your toolbox up even after this webinar is over. So we'll start with infant feeding basics, progress through the toddler months, think about introducing variety, then really talk about those picky eaters or finicky eaters, and think about other tips for de-stressing the mealtime process. We'll go over some best practices as far as what to put in the lunchbox, so adding a little bit of variety there, and then we'll end with Q&A. And so let's start at the beginning. If you're thinking about the age where your child is slowly going to progress to solids, when is that? How do you know? What do you consider?
Most of the time it's the 6-month mark. And I was thinking about this in relation to potty training as sort of guidelines and how each child is so different. So, like some kids are potty trained before they're 2, and then there's my son, who I hope he's potty trained by the time he's 20. So, kids just develop at different times. So the 6-month mark is the general guideline for when an infant should reach the developmental stages that would make them ready to actually be able to take food, put it into their mouth. So it's sort of those movements that you're thinking about when you're thinking about the development that would make them ready for that. That is being able to independently sit up, having the head strength to keep their heads up, that tongue thrust. So if you put something towards their mouth, their tongue doesn't immediately thrust out. So they're able to accept food at that point. And they're usually going to start grasping stuff, but it's more like this grasp, which would make them able to like hold a utensil or hold a piece of food. Some kids might start to actually be interested in other people's food at the table. And I say some kids because I think that if a child is able to pick up a toy and sort of bring it to their mouth, that's a really good indicator that they'd be able to do that with food. My son ate all of his meals with us. It was just really important to me since he was born to have him at the table with us, and he showed no interest in anybody's food, so I mean, kids are different, but if they have the developmental capability to actually pull something to their mouth, then they're probably ready. And developmental delays will delay this a bit, so definitely talk to your pediatrician about that. But in general, about 6 months is when those things should start to manifest.
Are there any other sort of health and safety things to consider? I know the sitting upright, the tongue. Are there anything else, from a health and safety standpoint to think through?
Yeah, those developmental characteristics are sort of what would help a baby be able to sit themselves in a high chair. So on the safety side of things, I can't stress enough how important it is to take an infant CPR class. And I think so often safety guidelines, especially with infant feeding, instill fear in us. And I'll say that the same thing happened to me as a parent. But when you think about it, having that CPR class, knowing, the high risk choking foods, knowing some of these safety guidelines really helps to reduce the fear, because you have the tools that you need and can be confident that you do. So I also recommend that even if you've had infant CPR class before and have had another baby and it's been a year or two, take a refresher course. I do this myself. I go on YouTube and take some refresher courses because I forget the details of infant CPR.
Yeah.
And then go ahead.
It's interesting to me that they recommend that you do that prior to having a baby, and then then you, as a mom, I forgot everything.
Same.
After I had my child, so maybe around the 3 to 6 month is a nice time to start thinking about that.
I think that's a great time. And there are also some nurses that I've seen pop up on Instagram who are doing infant CPR courses too. So that's, in our virtual world right now, that's a really good option too.
Nice.
And then in terms of like structure for safety, the high chair is really important. So, making sure that you have a high chair that keeps them upright, but also above the food, so they can feel some sort of autonomy in the meal situation. I say this from personal experience. When I first started feeding my son, we live in a New York City apartment and just have like a counter that we eat at. And I put one of those counter seats on the counter thinking I would save space in our apartment. And the poor guy was like below the counter and he wasn't interested in food when I first served it to him. And it was because he couldn't see it or actually engage with it because it was just improper proportions. And once we got him a high chair, it changed the game so much.
That's a great note to think through. So you are talking about engaging with food, and I know there's a couple different techniques out there. Could you talk through a couple of the techniques, and then we've just said there's no wrong answer, just pros and cons. Do you mind just going over that a little bit?
No, not at all. And actually, a lot of the safety guidelines, I think we're talking about feeding purees versus baby-led weaning or baby-led feeding, I prefer to call it. But a lot of the safety guidelines are the same for the two. So, like you don't want to leave baby alone while they're eating, no matter what feeding style you're using. You want to make sure that food is never hot when you give it to them. It's either cold or lukewarm. No honey until the end of the first year, even like included in foods. And then there are some differences when you look at baby-led feeding versus purees. But in general, like those safety guidelines are pretty much the same. And oftentimes I see those two feeding methods presented as sort of like you either start with purees or you either start with baby-led feeding. And actually a puree is a texture. So, I mean, if you're doing baby-led feeding, you're going to want to introduce purees, smoothies, thick, carrot soup, those types of things anyway. because that's important for baby to know how to eat too. And I also think that if you feel more comfortable starting with purees, there's no rule about how quickly you can progress to a more baby-led feeding routine too. So, I mean, there really is no right answer. The only right answer is to start introducing food and to introduce as many different flavors to that baby as you can before they turn 1, because that can really help with how many foods they accept after they turn 1.
So that's a great point to make. And I think that brings up 2 things. One is allergies, and then one is the time between introducing foods. There's some different thoughts on introducing food early or late as far as potential for allergies, and then time between. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. So oddly enough, if a child's at high risk for certain allergies, a pediatrician might recommend that they introduce food a little bit earlier. And that can actually, in recent studies, show that that might actually reduce the risk of certain allergies. So typically babies who have like severe to moderate eczema or a family history of allergies or an allergy themselves that's already been diagnosed would be at high risk. And so the feeding guidelines that I'll talk about today might be a little bit different for them. It's really important to talk to a pediatric allergy specialist in that case to see the timeline for introduction of foods. But in general, introducing the more allergenic foods, I mean, peanuts are one we always think about. That can happen right away. That doesn't need to wait as long as there's no allergy risk. And then in terms of waiting, this used to be kind of controversial, and really in infant feeding, it's not controversial anymore. The recommendation used to be wait 3 to 5 days, introduce one food, wait 3 to 5 days, see if there's any reaction. If there's not, then introduce one more food, wait 3 to 5 days. And the issue with this is that after 6 months of doing that, you haven't had the opportunity to introduce as many foods and flavors as you would if you were just introducing foods kind of as you eat them as a family. And so the American Institute, I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget the name, the American Academy of Allergies, Asthma and Immunology still recommends the 3 to 5 days, but none of the other childhood health organizations do. And from a dietitian standpoint, the dietitians that I work with all sort of say the same thing, which is introduce as many different flavors as you can during that time, with the exception of children who are at high risk for allergy.
Awesome. So if I'm a more high risk person, as a parent, maybe it's about using your judgment and also letting go of the 3-day and kind of going with your gut to see, how fast or slow you're introducing.
Yeah. And we can talk about, how many foods to introduce at once, but you would never be introducing 3 meals and 2 snacks to a 6-month-old anyway. The food in that first month especially is really just about, they hardly get any of it into their mouths anyway. It's really about exposing them to these foods. And so 1 meal a day, so if you're introducing three foods at a time, you can still keep a watch on if you see any type of reaction too that way.
Awesome. Any misconceptions about introducing fruit before veggies or one texture before the other?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to fruit before veggies, that's something I hear a lot, where it's kind of this warning, like, don't introduce fruit before veggies because then older babies won't accept veggies because the fruit's so sweet. But I mean, if you've ever tasted breast milk or formula, it's sweet, and that babies are supposed to like sweet stuff. So they're going to gravitate towards fruit. So fruit can actually be a really nice thing to introduce them to because they're likely to like it. But there's no research that shows, and there's no anecdotal evidence that shows that, or very little that shows that if you start with fruit, kids aren't going to accept veggies. So I think that's kind of a sigh of relief too, at least for me, just because my son tends to prefer fruit. I think little kids like fruit because it's sweet, like breast milk and formula.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we're starting. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say one more thing on the infant feeding that I hear a lot is the saying, food before 1 is just for fun. Mm-hmm. And I love that saying in one sense, and I think that it should be changed in another. And the reason I love it is because I think it takes the pressure off of us as parents feeding kids. That food before 1 is just for fun, in the sense that breast milk and or formula is still going to be providing the majority of their nutrients for that time. So the pressure is off to like make sure that your baby is eating, tablespoons of broccoli and salmon and all of these other nutrient rich foods. But on the other hand, I think that food before one is so vital, establishing a palate in a child and an excitement around eating, and also the idea of kind of the social aspect of eating, that it's more than fun in that respect. It's really important. So it's, the pressure is off when it comes to having all of these nutrients packed into each meals. It is fun in that sense before one, but also it's really vital that it gets introduced.
Where were you 2 years ago? It's going to be in my ear. This is such great perspective on how to think through it. I do love that you can take the pressure off a little bit to say we can be more fun, we can explore, and it's okay if it's not where they want to be yet. So you're starting to think about 6 months through all the way up to 36. Can you speak to a little bit about, if the goal is to have fun and more exposure to each age group, kind of a bullet point for each?
Yeah. So that 6 to 7 months, that is exposure, not just to different foods, but to the idea of eating. It sort of boggles my mind sometimes to think about, you watch this baby and you watch this toddler develop, and the things that you take for granted that adults do, that babies and kids had to learn at some point, and eating solids is one of those things. So actually, like this 6 to 7 month, even engaging with them with the idea of just food being something that you put in your mouth, but can also touch and can also experience the smell of, all of those aspects of food. And actually, whether you're doing baby-led feeding or purees, if you're doing purees, I love to use preloaded spoons. So if you get like a utensil or another like small spoon and put like maybe half of it filled with puree and hand it to your baby so they can hold it and they can feed themselves, then that helps get them engaged in the idea of utensils. It helps get them engaged in the idea of them regulating what they want to eat at all. And if you're doing baby-led feeding, then allowing them to grab what they want off of their tray. It's really that 6 to 7 months just time for them having fun with the exposure. And that brings up a good point. I think that if you notice that they aren't having fun at any point or are upset, they might just not be ready. And so I usually recommend, going back to exclusive breastfeeding or exclusive formula for a week and then giving it another try, because for an infant, a week can make a big difference. And since this is supposed to be fun and it's supposed to be introducing them to this idea of engaging with food in a positive way, it's better not to push them even from that point.
Great. So you're thinking about here increasing variety. We see on the screen exposure, maintaining safety. Anything you would speak to as we're starting to progress into the toddler ages?
Yeah. So safety wise, with introducing solids in puree versus baby-led feeding, you still want to have the CPR course, the things I talked about. The things that would be a little bit different with baby-led feeding would be paying a little bit more attention to what would be considered a choking hazard at that age. And basically, by the time a baby is probably around 10 months, 8 to 10 months, even if you started with purees, they're probably still going to be able to progress to pieces of solid food, especially as that pincer grasp develops and they're no longer kind of holding things only like this, but they're able to pick things up like this. So the choking hazard list sort of diminishes over time after the age of 1. But before that age, if you're doing baby-led feeding, things like whole grapes or cherry tomatoes, hot dogs that would be cut into like a coin shape, or vegetables cut into a coin shape, those would be considered choking hazards. So you always would want to slice those into pieces that baby could hold on to. And then also a great test is just being able to smush food between your fingers. If it's smushable, then it's an okay texture for them. And actually, from personal experience with my husband and baby-led feeding, he was terrified of gagging. And so gagging is it's an important part of baby-led feeding. It's going to happen. Babies gag reflex, and actually babies fed puree are going to gag too. Their gag reflex is really far forward in their mouth for safety reasons and prevents food from going down the wrong pipe. So seeing them gag is actually seeing them do what they're supposed to be doing with food that is potentially going to go around down the wrong pipe. But I definitely recommend that if you or a partner is nervous about the gagging, what I did with my husband is I pulled up gagging videos on YouTube. And you just watch other people feed their babies and you watch them gag. And it's really like interesting to see that you can tell the difference between a gag and choking. And then you start to see how babies are actually kind of using that gag reflex to learn how to swallow food the right way. So that was really helpful to Jared. So I thought I would mention, it was helpful to me too. I thought I would mention that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thinking about increasing exposure and enjoying, and you've got this awesome toddler meal formula. I'm also wondering, I know there's no magic answer to this, but how much is enough food? How often a day? Are you starting to get into a structure of 3 meals a day plus snacks? Like how does that start to form?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's kind of looking at guidelines. I always like to recommend parents or remind parents that guidelines are there to sort of remind us when to check in with our kids, but it's kind of a sliding scale either way on when an individual baby or child is ready. And also in terms of how much they eat. I have to laugh that so many of the guidelines for toddlers in terms of like fruits and veggie intake are written in cups. And it's like, I don't know a single toddler that's going to sit down and eat cups of veggies at a time. And I think that it makes us as parents feel like we're failing and feeding them when we see guidelines written that way. So, I mean, in the beginning, we're talking about like a tablespoon of food at a time, or, depending on how you're feeding them, a couple preloaded spoons with some puree, and then use their cues. If a baby is kind of leaning more towards you, tilting their head, opening their mouth, that probably means that they want to try a little bit more. And that's a really important, it's a really important start in teaching them that is respected, that their hunger and fullness cues are respected and will always be respected. With that said, also, I think that making sure that baby is not super hungry when they get to the table in these initial months, but also not full is really important. So giving them a little bit of breast milk or formula before they get to the table, but not too much, is great, because if they get to the table to eat and they're hungry and they're 6, 7, 8 months old, they just don't have the skills to eat enough to make them feel satisfied, and that can cause frustration around eating. So if they get to the meal feeling hungry enough to dabble in what's on the table, but not so full that they're not interested, that's important too.
How about when we start getting even more fun, when they can start to verbalize a little bit more, sort of maybe the 1 to 3-ish years? How are you thinking about what's too much to eat, what's not enough to eat, and when do you listen to them, when do you push and pull?
Yep. My blanket statement to that is never push. It almost always causes a friction at the table that does more damage than any nutritional intake would. And in general, I love there's a researcher in childhood nutrition, Ellen Satter, and she has a method that is parents provide, kids decide. So I think that parents provide the food, and then kids decide what they want to eat and how much of it they want to eat. And I think that an important caveat to this is that we're not talking about providing all new foods at one time. We're talking about providing things that, especially as they get a little older, that they already like and they'd be excited about, maybe with 1 or 2 new things. So they have one food that they feel really comfortable and safe with, and can get full from, and then 2 foods that they might consider trying. But when it comes to what they choose and the amount, as hard as it is as parents, and as much as you're thinking, like, I really wish that they would be getting XYZ nutrients in, it's better to just let them dictate what they eat and how much of it at the meal. And your comfort level as a parent can decide whether you're comfortable if your child at a later age says, like, I really just don't like this, but I'm hungry. If you want to make them something else, some people set a hard guideline that there are 3 meals and 3 snacks a day. So if you don't feel like you want to eat what's at the meal, you have a snack coming. And some parents feel more comfortable just like helping their child find something at that meal that they want to eat. There's no wrong answer to that. It's just kind of what you feel most comfortable with.
We were chatting about in this age group, it's also not about thinking of like the day to day, like, oh my God, they didn't eat vegetables on this day. It's about thinking more long term about it, right?
Absolutely. And long term, like for the month. I think so often, especially just because of the way media presents nutrition to us, we think of like each meal needing to be this perfect balance. And while we can present that to a child, they can decide what they want to eat. And so if they eat nothing but protein foods for a week, or nothing but carb foods for a couple of weeks, or nothing but fruit for a week.
I think one of our parents wrote, we're on the beige food diet. Like, this is it. When am I going to see broccoli come their way?
Yeah. And look at what they're eating over the course of a month. And kind of factor that in. So, but with that, I think that brings up an important point, which is exposure to food. So even if your child is choosing one food, offering other foods along with it is really important, because it can take 20 to 30 or more, depending on the situation, exposures to a food to get a child to the point where they feel safe and comfortable with that food. And exposure is not necessarily eating. It's just being around the food, seeing other people eating it, having it on the table, having it on their plate with the other foods that they're offered. So even if they don't choose to eat it, they've still been exposed to it. They've still been exposed to the idea of it.
Yep. What about, I only want to squish my food and play with the texture, and I'm not getting it in my mouth at all, or I might even want to throw that food, and it becomes not necessarily about something that I'm eating. All okay to a point? Is that predictable? Is that part of it?
Yeah, that's part of engaging with the food, especially for babies and younger toddlers. There are some techniques that you can use, like if you're doing preloaded spoons with even like more chunky solids on them, you can kind of have 3 going at once and be handing them to them to keep them busy, avoid kind of throwing stuff on the ground. But a lot of that is just completely normal developmental milestones, actually, for as they're going through eating.
Yeah, it sounds like.
And also, the messier that it is in the beginning, I think the more that they get to practice and engage with that and be messy, probably the quicker they're going to learn how to do things like sip from a cup, use utensils. It's going to be really messy in the beginning, but there's going to be a point where it clicks for them and they learn.
Yeah, that's a great point to make. You talked about a sippy, and one thing that's kind of built into this is when to introduce water and or how to get children to drink more water. Any thoughts or best practices on that?
Yeah, I love introducing a small cup of water right off the bat when you're introducing them to solids. And this is not, they're getting all the liquid they need from breast milk or formula. This is simply a fun thing for them to do to engage with the idea of sipping from an open cup. So some parents I know use shot glasses, with a couple tablespoons of water. Easy peasy makes these really cute little like 2-ounce cups. So put a few tablespoons of water in that and let them just practice bringing that to their mouth at 6, 7, 8 months. And then by the time they're hitting that 1+ age range, then they're going to be more comfortable using an open cup. Awesome.
Ideas to get children who are kind of off breast milk or formula into water? Sort of the same thing probably that you would say with the rest of the foods and flavors, right?
Yeah. And, as you're transitioning from the liquid nutrients to more solid foods, that transition is going to be just that. It's not going to be, like one day that they switch over. It's going to be kind of hopefully the smooth transition that's comfortable for everybody. And so I think recognizing where some things are fitting in as comfort and the importance of that, and also where you can make that transition smoother for like meals. So, I mean, I think introducing the cup early with water is important there because they get used to it, and it feels normal for them to have a cup of water with their meal. But also being gentle with yourself and your child in terms of that transition where they're starting to replace more of their liquid nutrients with solids, because there's just so much comfort related to that too. So that can take a different amount of time for different kids.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We talked a little bit about this in kind of progressing into the toddler years, and obviously we wouldn't have all these attendees if it wasn't also a stressful thing. I think being a parent and caring so much in and of itself can be stressful. I think part of what you talked about is so relevant of thinking about it, not the day-to-day, but the month-to-month. You were saying parents provide and children decide. And so any other tips or best practices for, picky or finicky eating?
Yes. So if you are starting to feed a 6-month-old, more variety, getting them used to kind of like meals with people, but also keeping in mind the attention span of little kids is very short. So if you can get a toddler at the table for 3 minutes, consider it a win. But if you've already got a toddler and didn't necessarily do, focus on variety on the front end, it's not too late. It's definitely not too late. There are plenty of things that you can do, and they would be the same things you would do whether you had introduced a lot of variety in that 6 to 12 month period or not. And that is, eat as many meals together as a family or just with an adult with the child as possible. Seeing adults eating stuff or seeing people around kids that they're interested in and look up to eating things is really powerful. And it's also a way to sort of engage kids in the power of a meal with people and show them that, that's where they also develop a lot of language skills. That's where they also develop social skills around that meal. So, if you can get kids involved in part of the meal prep and planning, that can also really help give them a sense of belonging in the meal, and a sense of having provided their family with something, which can be really exciting even for little kids. If you can let little kids go to the grocery store and pick out, a veggie that looks good to have for dinner, or they can help wash something for dinner or stir something, or even just stand in like a stool in the kitchen and watch adults in the house making something, that can give them a sense of excitement around even having it on the table or trying it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think, go ahead.
How do you get, have you had success with getting your child to stay at the table?
No.
And if not, what about having sort of a traveling dinner? Is that accepted in your house?
I think that with little kids, remembering that the attention span for little or toddlers, like the 2 to 4-year-old type group, is like 3 to 6 minutes is important here. So allowing them to try and continue to try to sit at the table and engage with food and other people at the table is really important. But this is where snacks become really important too. And so fitting in some of the foods that you might have wanted them to get in at a meal at snack time is also very important here too. Another thing with this is actually feet, little kids' feet. And this is the same with babies too. You want them to have something to put their feet on when they eat, because if their feet are swinging, that's really distracting. Think about, as adults, we take this for granted, but if your feet were just swinging while you were eating, you would not be as centered when you're eating, and you'd also be kind of distracted by that movement. So as kids get older, if you could put like a stool or a box or something that they can rest their feet on while they eat, if they're in a booster seat, or if their high chair doesn't have a footrest, wrapping like a bungee cord around it that they can sit their feet on can be really helpful in just helping them feel centered for eating and a little bit more focused.
I love that idea. We talked a little bit about some thoughts to push or not push. And so very much, thoughts about cleaning your plate. And I think you spoke to, you can be the parent to have the alternative. You can be the parent that says, okay, this is what we're having tonight, but having a snack later to make sure that it's important. But the one thing not to do is to push and use that language.
Yeah, it really, it affects how kids think about foods later on. So even if you really don't want to do anything to pull a baby or child away from their innate cues on when to eat, when to stop. And so I think that if you're feeding toddlers, if you're feeding little kids, you really want to teach them that those cues should always be respected, and that no food is better than another, because that's also creating a sense of scarcity around one food typically tends to put the focus on that food. And I think oftentimes as parents, we think of scarcity as being like, well, I'm not going to keep that in the house. That would be scarcity for sure. But also labeling certain foods as being better than others creates a sense of scarcity around the foods that are labeled as not being as good as others. And that really sticks with kids as they're developing their sense of eating on their own later on.
Wow, I love that. I'm going to go back and like reframe my language when I go home.
It's so hard. It's so hard, I think, to know that you want kids to be eating a certain way because you want the best for them. But really, when it comes to relationship with food, that is truly the foundation of nutrition. And trust in their own bodies is truly the foundation of nutrition and health. And so having those foundations to build on is really important.
That's amazing. And so part of it is reframing the positive language, which is, one of those options is building up or breaking down the scarcity model. And what we'll be doing with our attendees is we'll be sharing some best practices of, instead of saying, come on, have another, you love these, keep going. We're reframing some language for them, so they'll get that in the follow-up. And
that was a really good example though too, because I think that was I think a lot of us would think that was a positive example around food, except that really any messaging that sort of polarizes food into categories can be detrimental in the long term.
You want to have this again, like that kind of judgmental tone.
Or cheering for one food and not for another. It's why it's better and so hard to just remain neutral.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. It's all about being Zen in all of our components of parenthood. But I love this slide here because it talks to just giving our audience more variety in, kind of the big things that we should be trying to share with our children. So anything you want to share about this? It's sort of like how many ways you can make an egg. Here are some best practices for sneaking in the veggies.
Exactly. It's I think that oftentimes, and at least this was my experience, is that you want kids to accept food in the same way that you do. And there were certain foods that I was like, please let my son like this food because I like it so much that I want us to share it as a family. But I guess my example would be that I love roasted veggies. I just think that they're the best. And so I made roasted broccoli and my son was kind of like, nah, not so much. And then my husband made sauteed broccoli with tons of garlic and my son gobbled it up. And I was kind of like, it's not going to always be what you think that they're going to like. And form that foods take can be a really fun way to experiment with introducing different foods to a child within a vehicle that they already like, without having to hide foods. So I think that, like with eggs, you can, if they already like eggs, you could try making green eggs and chopping up some greens to put in them. Or you could try making like baked egg muffins, egg salad, those types of things that change up the texture. You can also change up the flavor with spices. And you can add things to vehicles that they already like in a way to sort of expose them to new foods so they feel safer with the new food because it's kind of engulfed in a food that they already feel safe with.
Yeah, so it sounds like just going back to the drawing board and really saying how many times can I do this in a different way Can I, add, can I hide it in there? Can I, um, can I do it in its raw form and show what it tastes like there?
Yeah, definitely. And when it comes to like hiding foods and stuff, my preference is always, even if like I make smoothies for my son sometimes and I put frozen cauliflower in them because it's delicious and it's an easy way to get cauliflower in, but I always tell him,
Mm.
like, let's label what's in this smoothie. It's got mango, it's got cauliflower, it's got banana. And so that way he thinks, wow, I like the smoothie, has cauliflower in it. um,
Association with
maybe
cauliflower
when
is now positive.
yeah,
Yeah,
maybe when my parents put roasted cauliflower on the table, I'll give it a try because I know that it's already in something that I like.
love it. So all of these are wholesome, whole ingredients, and I have to ask the question: are there any snacks or like pre-prepared foods you've endorsed in a like, if I have to put this in the rotation, or quick grabbing on the go? Any things that you really like or would feel good about?
Oh gosh. I mean, to that I would say any that fit into your family's routine. So, I think that as the reality today is that like most of us don't have the time or at this point bandwidth to like prepare full home cooked meals. And I mean, it's great if you can and it's great if you can't too. So there are plenty of prepackaged foods that become part of the mix. And also that can help when your kids are littler and you sort of have full control over what is in the house and what they're exposed to. Then I mean, you can offer them whatever you want them to be choosing from. You're providing fully. But I mean, once they go to school or once they start going to birthday parties or once they start having friends and going over to their house, they're going to be exposed to a lot more foods. And so that's a good thing. And I think that providing a foundation at home of sort of making mealtime enjoyable and the social aspect of mealtime and, having the foods in your house that you feel comfortable and enjoy having around, no matter what they are, is important, but also realizing that you don't want to necessarily stigmatize any food, because then if your child sees it outside of the home, there's going to be that scarcity model. So I mean, definitely I use prepackaged snacks a lot with my son. I think it's kind of where your comfort level lies.
Yeah, Dr. Prager's kale littles, stand by those.
Sometimes it's honestly the only, especially as kids get older and their meal timing might not be, I mean, my son goes to bed at 7 and my husband and I usually eat at like 8 or 9 because of that, because it's just like the only time that we have each day that's just the two of us, but we don't want him sitting at the table just eating by himself. So usually we'll make him something kind of a faster version, something like, Dr. Prager burger, or, a piece of salmon that we had cooked the day before, or something like that, and sit and eat with him. So I think that really being able to engage with them around the food is so important, no matter what you're serving them. And the prepackaged foods have definitely been a savior for us.
That's awesome to hear. Just wanted to get that one on the record to say it's okay. And especially, I think with your toddler ideas, if you're looking at this, I'm hoping that this is just giving you maybe 1 or 2 things that you wouldn't have thought of to put in a lunch, whether you're on your way to Vivvi to pack your lunch or whether this is something that you're enjoying at home. I think what's great about this is we're not in the kitchen whipping this up a la minute to put on the plate for them. This is canned. This is make a big pot of it for the week and pop it in the lunch, periodically, right? You're not you're cutting corners and making things efficient too, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the way that I see lunch for myself too, when I pack lunch for work, was like leftovers. There was no way that I was whipping something up just for my lunch, and that's the way that I see toddler lunches too. As you start to have meals together and your baby starts to engage with foods, then leftovers from those meals, I think, are just perfect additions to lunches. And so I think on the resources that you'll send, I put a couple Instagram accounts that have lunch ideas too, which I just love, where they just show what's inside the lunchbox. But yeah, leftovers make amazing lunches.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sending these. This is also on Willow's resources, so we'll be sending them over to you. And I think at this point, we've got a nice 10 minutes left. I'd love for any questions that we have to pop in the chat. And while we're waiting for questions to pop up, Willow, one of the things that we talked about earlier this week was like the don't yuck my yum. When someone says, ugh, this tasted bad, or, ooh, you're eating that, that's gross. What your philosophy is to say.
Yeah, I always try and teach kids to not yuck someone else's yum. So you're allowed to have your opinion about food for sure, and that's an important part of eating, but you never want to make someone else feel bad about something that they enjoy. And also, I think language for little kids, at least my son, I've noticed he will say, I don't like this when he's full. So, like engaging with them and teaching them the language around eating and eating with other people is also important.
Yeah, my son says this tastes old to me. And I think it really is for him saying, I'm not really vibing on this texture. And so you can just say, okay, well, that's an interesting way to phrase it. It's very new. I just made it.
I guess with their attention span, even if it's been at the table for 1 minute, it's probably old to a toddler.
So we had one question specific to the basic meal formula side of high energy food. Can you speak to what high energy food is?
Yeah. So the high energy foods would be foods that are really packed with calories. So you'd want like full fat, something like full fat Greek yogurt, something like avocado. I wrote down a list. Oils, nut butters, but for babies, you always want to make sure it's a really runny nut butter, because thicker nut butters can be a choking hazard. Cheeses, like grated cheeses or shredded cheeses for a baby or toddlers. So really high calorie foods, just because they're not going to be able to eat a big volume of foods. So you want to pack in some energy into the smaller amounts.
We thank you for that. We had another question that was around any protein or high protein alternatives to meat that you kind of pop in.
Yes, definitely. And so especially in those beginning months when you serve protein foods, the higher iron protein foods are really important. So things like egg yolks, beans, lentils, those foods are definitely packed with both protein and iron. So are good kind of first foods for those first 6 months, and then beyond. I mean, in the toddler years as well.
That's great. Concerns about vitamins in cooking and the vitamins disappearing. I think like maybe steaming broccoli versus boiling broccoli. Resources, or can you help with ideas to cook food outside of steaming or baking?
Sure. I think in general, and I talk to my adult clients about this too, variety is the best way to sort of get a wide nutrient profile in what you're eating, and also kind of looking at our eating over the course of a week or a month. And so some foods lose more nutrients than others with different ways of cooking. So if you're getting a variety of foods in, chances are that you're getting a wide variety of nutrients in, even if there's some nutrients lost in cooking. Basically, cooking anything with like water soluble nutrients in it. So, vitamin C is one I hear a lot. Though you're going to lose a lot of that nutrient. So just offering a variety of foods. Microwaving, actually, I think in research has been shown to retain the most of the water soluble nutrients. So microwaving in a little bit of water to steam it for things like broccoli. But honestly, I think that getting caught up in thinking about the individual nutrients in foods for both adults and children is just more complex than is needed for overall good nutrition. As long as you're serving a variety of foods, you've got this. And I don't think that if you prefer a certain cooking method, go with that one, because you're going to eat it more often. Like if it's not worth a little bit less nutrient loss to eat something that you aren't enjoying as much as you would be if you were doing a cooking method that loses a little bit more nutrients.
That makes sense. I love it. Oh, I hope you're making people breathe sighs of relief. Got a fun one. What's the best way to limit sugar intake? Like cupcakes. We probably see that at school a lot, or phrase it to a toddler to sort of avoid that positivity, negativity against language.
Yeah. I guess two things I forgot to mention in terms of like starting with infant feeding is that you never want to hold infants on your lap when you're feeding them, no matter what feeding method you use, because then you can't see if they're choking or not. And then the other is try not to add a lot of salt and sugar to family meals. If you're kind of sharing those family meals with infants, let people add those themselves, just because especially with salt, infant kidneys aren't able to process salt as much. Then as kids get older into the toddler years, I think with sugar, and this is the same for adults too, is just making sure that kids aren't going too long without eating, that they're having regular meals and snacks, and they're exploring foods through meals and snacks. And then at home, figuring out what works best for you and what your comfort level is with sugary foods. One thing I always recommend to parents is to include something that we would quote unquote call a dessert with dinner for kids, and let them eat it in any order they want. If they want to have a cupcake first and then eat the rest of their food, this really helps to neutralize foods for kids. Then when they're out at a birthday party or they're out at school and those things are served, they don't think like, I only get this food I only get this food at school parties. I better eat as much of it now as I can. They can really listen to their bodies and say, do I like this? Do I feel like eating this? Do I want something else instead? That can be really powerful. And I think as parents, it's really hard, especially we're so steeped in diet culture messages right now, especially around sugary foods. It can be hard to take that step back, but in the long run, making sure that kids are not super hungry when they go to birthday parties, stuff like that, but then just stepping back and letting them regulate themselves around those foods is probably the best thing that we can do for a long-term relationship with food.
That makes sense. I love it. Thank you. That was a good one. We didn't even bring up cupcakes until the very end. We've got a couple more minutes. Any other last questions? I do have, I want to just clarify, there's a little word bubble that says Q&A, and then there's a more that says chat. And for some reason, I'm only able to see the chat. So I want to make sure. Let me just stop sharing for a moment. Amazing. Okay, I can see some of these now. Thank you. Any good suggestions for 6 to 12 month baby finger foods? Concerned about heavy metals in store-bought puffs and rice crackers.
Yeah, and also that's been all over the news lately too. And I think that the rice cereal introduction sort of fits into what would be considered sort of older advice, just like waiting 3 to 5 days for all infants across the board between new foods. The recommendation isn't that you have to start with rice cereal anymore. And specifically, like if you do mix it up, don't just use rice cereal, but it's not necessary. So I think that, sorry, what was the original question? I got totally off track.
For baby
finger foods. Anything that has that squishable texture. So steamed sweet potato fingers. It's really anything that's in a finger shape that's longer than a child's hand, so they can hold it like this and eat it like this, because this is the way that they're going to do it. So bananas with like half a banana with half of that peel off, so they can hold on to the peel. If you're going to use something that's kind of squishy, like avocado slices, you can dip those in like crushed cereal, so they have a little bit of friction so kids can hold on to them. I'm trying to think, baked apples without the skin is also a really good one, and you can introduce spices to those too.
And then I'm going to just end with one more question, because this sort of speaks to like taking this into the world and your son growing. The 3 and 4 year old ages, and maybe we haven't exposed them enough. And just going back to what you said, how do we get stubborn kids or who are showing their independence to just start thinking a little bit more broadly about food and enjoying food? And I think that's a wonderful way to probably sum up your philosophy.
Yeah, including them at family meals, being realistic about what their attention span is, letting them see the people around them eating a variety of foods, introducing foods in different forms and experimenting with what their preference might be, getting them involved in meal prep, whether that's washing something, watching someone in the kitchen, or picking something out at the grocery store. And then using vehicle foods, so foods that they already feel really safe and excited about, as ways to get them more comfortable with other foods. And also using things like dips and dressings and things that they really like to make foods more appealing that they might be skeptical about. But I think most of all, being realistic that it can take a lot of exposures, and that you are not failing if you put something on the table and your child doesn't choose to eat it, because that's an exposure and that's a powerful exposure. So it might not feel like it at the time, but then a few months later, you might notice that they're more engaged with that food. And I think that's the tough part about feeding little kids, is that it's not, you don't get instant gratification very often at all. And I mean, I go through this too, but you might notice in months that it made a difference.
That is a wonderful place to finish. What great bullet points right there. It's been a pleasure. I've already jotted down a number of things that I've learned from you today, and wanted to just remind everyone that we will be sending some information from Willow. She's got amazing Instagram recs. She's got all of this basically in a resource page that we'll be following up with you. And she can also recommend people that you can connect with in the New York City or broad area as well. Willow, thank you so much for everything.
Thanks. This was really fun.
Great. It's so great to have you. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a wonderful day.